So my name is Dr. Tony Jewell. I'm a retired public health doctor, and after my retirement I decided to edit and publish my grandfather's memoirs. This had been in the family since his death in 1974, but we hadn't published it, and it actually resided in initially in a small little handwritten notebook, which one of my cousins converted into a Word document. And so what I received was a Word document, and my sister was an archivist on the family photographs because my grandfather was a keen photographer. And so, yes, we published the book in 2016, called On Call in Africa in War and Peace.
Did he ever tell you much about his experiences, if you knew, when you were younger?
No, it's extraordinary reflecting on it, because he died in 1974, by which time I had been a medical student for about 5 years, at least 4 at least. He knew that, and I used to stay with him often and see him, but he never discussed that. And what's also surprising is my father was a surgeon in Kenya for 30 years, and he knew about the diary. In fact, had lent it to some historians in Africa, but he had never particularly discussed this either. And when I started to do the memoir, the descriptions were of places which I had visited, but in terms of visiting a game reserve. So there were plenty of opportunities to say, oh, by the way, Voi, Mount Kilimanjaro, this was an area where your grandfather was active during the First World War, and never happened. So doing the memoir was really interesting, and I learned a lot. And he was offered a post in the Seychelles, which sounded pretty good to him.
Again,
I think
colony.
Yes,
Yep.
And he had I think he'd had relatives who had been in South Africa, so I think within the family there was knowledge about the British Empire, and obviously in that time, the late 19th century, the British Empire was very substantial. It was in the news through things like the Boer War, and he presumably became aware of this, and sense of adventure and so on, went to Seychelles. And he was in the Seychelles as a medical officer for 4 years when the war was declared, First World War, and he wanted to enlist to support the war effort. And obviously, because he had been in Seychelles, that East Africa was the place that he was advised to go and sign up. I think the rest of the German colonies in Africa were overcome quite quickly. But German East Africa, which nowadays is Tanzania, wasn't given away, as it were, easily. And there was a German, he was a lieutenant colonel at that stage, later promoted to general. Von Lettow was an extremely able military leader, and so it wasn't a pushover. But when my grandfather arrived from Seychelles to Mombasa, he went first to Lake Victoria, a place called Kisumu, where he was posted, and there was some initial battles up on Lake Victoria, because obviously Lake Victoria, incidentally the size of Ireland, was a strategic location. You have the Belgian Congo on one side, British East Africa, German East Africa, and Nyasaland and so on. So Lake Victoria was a strategic location, and so there were some initial battles around that time, and he was involved in that. And then he moved down to Voi, because they were planning the defense of the railway between Mombasa and Nairobi, which was being ambushed and attacked, and then also planning the subsequent planned invasion of German East Africa. So he went down there and was appointed in charge of a field ambulance service.
And his day-to-day life through the First War, did that actually change a great deal? I mean, what was he up to as a medical?
Well, when it started, I mean, I think it was pretty good, because he would have been an army officer living in relatively good premises in Kisumu, war conditions, but it hadn't started to bite at that stage. And when he went down to Voi is a very small town, even in those days, which is essentially a refueling stop for the Uganda Railway. Then conditions would have changed, and he starts to live in a tent or a makeshift banda, and suddenly it becomes more difficult to secure drinking water, to have adequate sanitation, and so it starts to feel different, I think, in Voi. And obviously when you then start the campaign within German East Africa, it gets substantially worse. So he was running a field ambulance team as part of the King's African Rifles, which was an African regiment, and so he wasn't part of the Indian Army, because the Indian Army had sent an expeditionary force to East Africa, and they had their Indian Medical Service, so he was different to that. So he was part of the King's African Rifles, essentially African troops with European officers. So his field ambulance was designed to follow the infantry near the fighting men as possible. So some of the initial training they were doing was how to recover wounded soldiers, how to transport them back to safety, how to run a dressing station, how to run a clearing station, and very much active, mobile, supportive team. Yeah.
So if you were a soldier there and you were wounded in battle, what actually would happen to you, and how would your grandfather have?
Yes, he has pictures. He has pictures. He was a keen photographer, and photography was beginning to build up at that stage. And we have something like 400 black and white photographs of his time. And when he was initially there, before they started to fight, he had to train his team, which consisted of an Indian Zorawar Singh, who was a sub-assistant surgeon, who was Indian origin, had a lance corporal from Nyasaland, I think, or Rhodesian force. He had African orderlies, so it's a multi-ethnic team, and then he had a whole lot of ambulance carriers, as it were, and those were the people that he would train to stand behind fighting forces, to go and recover wounded people on stretchers. Some of the stretchers had bicycle wheels to enable mobility. Otherwise, there'd be normal stretchers back to dressing stations and clearing houses, so where my grandfather would be based to give immediate medical assistance. Yeah.
And if you were wounded that badly and you couldn't be patched up in your grandfather's care,
yes,
what would happen to you then as a soldier? If you were an African, or
yes,
indeed if you were a European, what
yes,
would be the next step?
Well, they followed standard British Army evacuation plans, which is you do have these mobile units, then you have a clearing station, which people try and do triage, which we would understand nowadays. They say this person is so severely injured he's not going to survive. This person only needs a wound dressed and maybe go back to the front. This person needs to move back to base hospital. And those are the sort of decisions being made at that point. And then base hospital, they would do simple surgery, but if someone had got a major injury or abdominal wound or something, they would have to go back to a base hospital, which might be very difficult to do in Africa. If they were close to the railway line, it'd be a lot easier. But as the fighting developed, effective railway lines, effective roads and motorised transports just didn't exist, which caused some of the higher mortality associated with East Africa.
Yes, so and failing that, if they got to the hospital way behind the lines, they might
Yes.
eventually be sent on a hospital ship or something.
Yes, I think there was, in Nairobi, for example, in Mombasa, there would be hospitals that you and I would recognise, and then be rehabilitation centres to get people back to a state where they could rejoin their unit. Well, I think that the first thing to say is the terrain is inhospitable. I grew up in Kenya as well, and the area that he was based in and went into German East Africa is still a game reserve. So Tsavo, West Amboseli, Serengeti, Ngorongoro Crater, these are all game reserves 100 years later, which means that they are very rough African bush terrain. No sources of water necessarily, you have to look for it. Rainy seasons that come and completely flood rivers, wash away roads if they existed, pathways. African heat, and insects, and indeed wild animals. So quite different. In the First World War in Europe, you wouldn't have rhinos coming through, or elephants or lions, because obviously the more casualties you got along the way with your horses and oxen, you got lions were attracted and leopards to the carcasses.
Well, you think that was a real problem for the troops? Well,
it's not so much a problem, it's just another thing to consider. My grandfather talks about they were camping, had a fire one evening. They were just sitting around the fireplace, not fireplace, but a campfire, and there was a scream, and this padre, who apparently had either been a Oxbridge Blue or a Olympic sprinter, came rushing into the clearing. And he's saying he was being chased by the lion, and sure enough, soon after, this lion appeared and looked at them all around the fire and then made off. But that would be an example where people are sitting, as it were, quietly in the evening around a campfire, and someone gets chased by a lion. And then other comments about suddenly hearing gunshots at evening was then found to be 2 or 3 rhinos had to be shot because they'd come into the camp. So, and my grandfather later in the book talks about an area that had lots and lots of snakes. Yes. And then obviously crossing rivers with crocodiles. So this, I wouldn't want to overplay that, but it is different to Northern Europe.
Yes, certainly. And what about the geography itself?
Well, German East Africa was about 3 times the size of Germany. So the distances were quite huge. Very few roads, if any. 2 railways, 2 basic crossing German East Africa railways. That's it. Very little motorised transport. And when you do have it, it was quite variable in its utility, because when the rains came, they just slid off the road. And if there was a road, and then the roads would stop. And so the British Army started thinking about the horses. So they had cavalry coming with horses, but the horses died of sleeping sickness, which is transmitted by tsetse fly. And then they thought about oxen pulling carts. And then the oxen died of sleeping sickness as well, because at certain altitude in Africa, the higher altitude, tsetse fly don't survive. So it's no sleeping sickness, and you can have farms and you can have horses. So the Kenya highlands, for example, is good farming land, no tsetse fly. But you come down altitude, you get tsetse fly, you don't, unless they're resistant to it, you don't survive. So the horses would survive 2 weeks or so, and the oxen would survive a similar length of time. So basically the army had to have recourse to human carriers to transport their supplies over hundreds of miles in adverse conditions with thorn bushes, arid, and no obvious water supply, which made the whole logistics very, very difficult. And then, as we've already said, getting wounded people back was extremely difficult. There's a good book about marching to Tanga by Brett Young, who was a doctor in the army, and he just described having been wounded, just lying there wondering how he's going to be evacuated. And they had to be carried by people, over their shoulders, essentially, to another station, had to wait another 12, 24 hours, and then eventually get back to motorized ambulance, and then eventually get to a train which took him to a base hospital. So I think the logistics were different in the Western Front. However horrendous the trench conditions were, the medical services were very close by, and they were able to evacuate people pretty fast to substantial base hospitals, whereas in East Africa that simply wasn't possible. Well, they suffered very badly. I mean, there was this kind of assumption also that African would survive some of the tropical diseases, like, say, malaria, typhoid. And say, oh, well, the Africans are used to this, they'll survive. But quite a lot of the tribes they recruited from were tribes where malaria was not prevalent. So they were as vulnerable as anyone else to malaria. Similarly, the diet. There's presumptions about diet being standard, but if you think about the British forces in Africa, you had African tribes whose diet varied. So where they were recruiting from different tribes, their diet varied. Not sure how much note was made of that. Then you had Indian troops, some would be Muslim, some Hindu. So you'd have lots of issues about diet, pork, not pork. And then you have European soldiers, some from South Africa with a diet, and some from Europe. And then you'd have West Africans, so you had the Nigerian and Gold Coast regiments. Again, would have different resistance to disease, different expectations about what they can eat and drink. So quite a complicated logistical supply. I mean, malnutrition was just very common. There's a presumption, I think, that the British troops in the warfare were malnourished. The carriers certainly would have been.
Yes.
I mean, if they're carrying a load, I think it was assumed that, not assumed, but estimated that more or less the whole of their load would have been the expectation that they would have eaten or drunk that, just because of the energy of walking hundreds of miles with a 56-pound pack on your back, or carrying.
Pointless, really, then.
Yes, well, I mean, it's incredible, really, when you think about it.
Yes.
And there was quite a lot of controversy about sunstroke, for example. People marching during the heat of the day, setting off at 10 o'clock, and maybe stopping at 4 o'clock, which is a red hot tropical African heat, without any confidence that you've got enough water for people. So, yeah, I think a phenomenal challenge. Well, so the first thing, from a public health perspective, that good health requires people to have clean water to drink, for them to have enough food, so they are well nourished, to have shelter, especially in nighttime for sleeping, to have sanitary arrangements so feces doesn't get mixed up with drinking water, and clothing, because it actually can get very cold at night as well, just like in the desert, very hot during the day, very cold at night. So for the health of troops, you need to think about all those things, as well as prevention, such as vaccinations, and so-called prophylaxis, where you would be giving people antimalarials. So, for example, you and I go on holiday, you'd be taking antimalarials every day. That didn't happen. So, for the health of the troops, you need to think about sanitary hygiene. Then you need to think about how can you prevent tetanus and typhoid by vaccinations. And then you start to think about how you treat illness. And the three leading causes of death were malaria. My grandfather had to leave the field ambulance, I think, on at least 2 occasions back to base when he had very, very bad malaria. Typhoid, largely due to poor hygiene, sanitary arrangements, and pneumonia. So those were the three leading causes. But then you had other really irritating things that can lead to problems, such as a jigger flea, which gets in under your nails on your feet and then lays the eggs, and then the eggs burst open, and then you get an ulcer, and then you get infected. So the jigger flea was, a real problem for the troops, and typhus and so on. So you had lots of diseases and afflictions that affected people, especially because it was the tropics. There weren't many troops that had been in the Western Front, but there are reports of some of them being, sent to East Africa, saying they prefer to be back at the Western Front. For the conditions they thought, despite all the horrors of the trenches, they felt was preferable to being in East Africa. So it was tough. So this is quite a small campaign in thinking about the First World War, but it was estimated that something like 105,000 people died in the East Africa campaign, which I gather is the same as the USA's losses in the First World War in totality, and it's something like 3 months of the Somme. So there was significant mortality, but of the fatalities, if you just took soldiers, 2/3 of the soldiers that died, and so that's Indian and British and South African soldiers who died, would have died from disease rather than injury, war injury. And then if you looked at...
With what would have been a similar statistic on the Western Front, do you think?
Much smaller for the diseases, yes, much smaller. And partly because the medical system in the Western Front was much closer to the fighting, which was pretty static. And you had a developed, at that time, relatively developed European country with hospitals and substantial buildings, where in East Africa you had African bush, essentially. And so then looking at, say, the carriers and followers, who were these people that were transporting supplies, something like 42,000 were recorded dying. This is probably an underestimate, which something like 99% of them were from disease and not war injuries. So the bulk of the casualties were actually disease, not war injuries. So I think the importance of disease, has been recognised over the last few hundred years. But basically, I think the RAMC, the Royal Army Medical Corps, was established in 1898, and that was they started to become effective in the Boer War. But even in the Boer War, they lost more soldiers from typhoid than other causes. So quite a steep learning curve for armies to pay attention to nutrition of the troops, shelter, hygiene, prevention, tetanus injections, typhoid injections, as well as treating illness when it arises. Yes, actually, this is referred to as the Pike Report, which was a report done for the War Office. It was meant to be kept secret for 100 years, but it has been disclosed a bit earlier now. But they visited British East Africa and German East Africa during 1918, and actually visited my grandfather's unit while he was out on campaign. And thankfully, he wasn't criticised, but actually, was one of the units felt to be doing this job properly. The Pike Report, Pike himself and someone called Balfour visited many different sites in the First World War, including, I think, Mesopotamia and Palestine and Balkans, as well as East Africa. And I think there'd been feedback to the government that some of the medical services, which had caused such a loss of fighting men's capability, hadn't been managed and led in the right way. But trouble is, I suppose by 1918, first part of 1918, is a little bit late in regards to making big changes in the First World War. But I think there are still lessons that I guess the RAMC has taken forward into the future. So I think there's been huge progress made. The RAMC, I think, established in 1898, first became active in the Boer War, which is around about 1902, where typhoid actually was the big killer, not gunshot wounds. And then in the First World War, and they've learnt key lessons. It's constantly improved. Part of that is proper evacuation plans for injured people in warfare, get them back, assess them, get them back to clearing houses, and then get them back to a base hospital if they need to, or dress the wounds and send them back up to the front. So I think that has improved hugely. And obviously in East Africa, the logistics of transport was just very, very difficult. In the same way as carriers had to carry supplies, well, stretcher bearers had to carry bodies back to the clearing houses, hospitals, etc. So mobility and transport has changed hugely, especially with helicopters. And I think in all the modern warfare in the Middle East, there's been huge learning about immediate treatment of wounded soldiers and civilians. For example, blood transfusions and getting people attended to by paramedics and back to base hospitals as fast as possible in order to treat them. And I think the survival is fantastic now. Many of those lessons actually feeding into the NHS in terms of best practice in accident emergency departments and emergency medicine. So I think they've made leaps and bounds. But in regards to the East Africa campaign, I think we should also take our hat off to sanitary hygiene measures, preparation of troops, training, expectations of the environment they'll be fighting in. Tropical environments very different to Northern Europe, and vaccinations of commonly occurring diseases, make sure people have been vaccinated fully, prophylactic treatment for preventing malaria, advice about malaria nets, and wearing long sleeves and using insect repellents. I mean, all this sort of stuff is not rocket science, but it's really important for an army to get right. And I think the RAMC does that nowadays, and I think there's been incremental development of knowledge and skills since that time.
It's amazing that your grandfather was operating at a time when there wasn't even penicillin.
Absolutely, yes. So you think of dirty wounds in war, in a place where you don't have access to clean water. At one stage in his book, he talks about advising his staff to wash their hands in iodine. So he had iodine, but he didn't have fresh water and soap. So he said, well, just use the iodine to clean your hands and to clean things up as best you could do, which was probably sound advice, yeah. Yes, I think, over 4 years that he was in the British Army in East Africa, obviously there were times when, he had downtime, times when he was very active in the role that the field ambulance served. So the time when they were very, very busy, he described when they had 500 casualties in one day. There was a very vicious fight where both sides took heavy losses, and he describes in his war diary, which is in the National Archive, having to treat 500 casualties, and some of those casualties, as described in the book, were severe casualties. So this is gunshot wounds through the jaw, through the brain, through the neck, through the chest, and so on. These are not trivial injuries, and having to operate in a very relatively primitive environment. So that was, I think, very stressful, recognised by his recommendation award of Military Cross for that time.
Your book has pictures of the kind of places he was working. So
that's right. Yes. So you imagine sort of tents, bandas which are made of wood and straw, and any outbuilding of a farm or a church. I mean, they would be using churches, colonial farm buildings, and in fact using the farm railways, because many farms up there had little mini railways, and there are pictures of using whatever mechanized transport they could, which was better than having to loaf everything over your shoulder. So that would be an example of big battle, lots of casualties, very stressful, very difficult, challenging. And then the other one would be when he was advancing through German East Africa, and they came across a German hospital, a hospital run by the Germans, and my grandfather at that time was running a temperature of, I think he reports, at 106, and was feeling pretty groggy, but was in charge of his team, and this German doctor was extremely friendly to him, and there was an English nurse who had been in German East Africa before the war in a mission hospital, and she had been brought in to work in this German hospital. And the doctor just took over the medical facilities. My grandfather made the nurse in charge, said, you're in charge of the hospital on my behalf. And the German doctor actually treated my grandfather for his malaria. They had good access to quinine. The British troops often didn't. So he treated him, and he reports that part of that treatment was some quite nice red wine, which he hadn't enjoyed for quite a while. And I think that's an example where actually there was something that we might refer to as gentlemanly behavior. I mean, one of the generals reported that the German forces thought we were foster parents. They kept leaving their women and children and wounded soldiers for us to look after, because there are obviously more heads, more mouths to feed, and more, sick people to look after was not something that the general would particularly look for. But I think there was this bit of give and take. Indeed, there are stories of British soldiers getting excellent surgical treatment by German doctors, and the German service, by and large, was thought to be very good. His book, actually.
His book, yes,
it's Norman Parsons, my grandfather, who wrote the memoir and who did the sterling work there during the First World War, and stuff that I didn't know about, and I'm pleased to have found out about. And things that I've learned, actually, because there's a huge area of ignorance in my mind about a lot of this, and so it's been a good experience for me as well.
Yes. Well, thanks very much for sharing your...
Okay, good.